to say that this bill has the strictest safeguards in the world it's not an argument, it's flat out wrong, and it's very, very misleading.
Coming up on British Thought Leaders, Professor David Paton talks about why he opposes the end-of-life bill.
For a doctor whose objective is they came into this for caring for patients and feel it's deeply wrong to assist in killing somebody, actually they will have to materially cooperate. And for many doctors and nurses, that's going to be a very, very serious issue.
Professor Paton talks about the economics of deliberate killing and the risks of putting a value on human life.
People in the public don't like to hear about the idea that we're passing assisted suicide laws to save the state money. So, they try not to sort of talk about this too much publicly, but without doubt it's there, under the surface.
Welcome to British Thought Leaders, I'm Lee Hall. Today I'm sitting down with Professor of Industrial Economics David Paton. David, thanks for joining us.
Good to be here.
So the end-of-life bill is going to be discussed in Parliament next week, and you've been quite vocal in your opposition to it. What are your main concerns?
Well, there's a whole raft of issues. So the bottom line is, in principle, my belief is that deliberately killing innocent people is wrong. That's not me as an economist, but from an ethical point of view. And when you breach that principle, I think you come across all sorts of problems. Ultimately, we're dealing with very vulnerable people at the end of life, or who are suffering, or who are in pain. We know that vulnerable people may express all sorts of wishes and desires. Once you go down the route of saying, well, a solution to genuine problems, and of course there are real issues, is for a medic, for a doctor to potentially help their patients to kill themselves, to assist suicide, you really breach the line. And we have a traditional approach to suicide that we see it as something that's tragic. We don't criminalise the person who is committing suicide. We try and treat them with care and compassion, but we never allow other people to help. So if somebody's on the top of a building, we don't say we have the right to push them off. We say, well, what we will do, can we help you in any way? Can we sort of find an alternative way of dealing with these problems? And actually, assisted suicide ultimately is the same issue. They're identifying a certain group of people. In this case, with this bill, it's people who are terminally ill. But we know that in other areas, it's a much broader group of people, and saying, well, for this group of people, if you express a desire to die, rather than trying to address that problem, we'll say, yes, we will help you. And I think that's wrong. But of course, there are all sorts of very practical issues with this particular bill. So there's, we were told it has the strictest safeguards in the world. Well, actually, you look at one particular aspect. This bill will allow doctors to raise the issue of assisted suicide with their patients. In other words, to say somebody in a very vulnerable situation, who perhaps is looking for care, and we've got scarce hospital resources or hospice care, and they can say, well, have you thought perhaps about the alternative of ending your life, and this is something we can help you with. Well, you can see the dangers of that. People who are vulnerable and naturally feel a little bit, am I a burden on family, carers? It doesn't have to be outright coercion, of course. It can just be this genuine feeling that, we're worried of the burden we're putting on our friends and family, and indeed perhaps the health system. And this suggestion then comes, or have you considered the idea of ending your life? Now, some places that have legalised assisted suicide, like Victoria in Australia, have explicitly forbidden doctors from doing that. They say, well, it's legal, but the patient has to raise it themselves. Whereas in other areas like Canada, doctors are allowed to raise it. And we know that does lead to a big increase in the number of people who are killed through assisted suicide. So straight away, to say that this bill has the strictest safeguards in the world it's not an argument, it's flat out wrong, and it's very, very misleading. There's other issues with it in practice. We know that they've said that doctors and nurses, many of whom are very worried about being drawn into helping to kill their patients, are told, well, there's a conscience clause, so you can opt out of this if you don't choose to do it. And that's not strictly true, in the sense that although you don't have to participate if you're a doctor or a nurse in the killing, you do have to then refer the patient to somebody else who will be prepared to participate. And that's quite a big step. That's different, for example, to the conscience clause in the Abortion Act. And you can think, for a doctor whose objective is they came into this for caring for patients and feel it's deeply wrong to assist in killing somebody, actually they will have to materially cooperate. And for many doctors and nurses, that's going to be a very, very serious issue. There's other problems with the bill, but straight away we can see there's a problem in principle, but also with the practical way in which this bill has been put together.
As you've mentioned, this is a massive change for us, that allowing deliberate killing. It feels like there's a push to kind of vote the bill through and worry about the details later. Do you think our lawmakers have been given enough time, enough information to make an informed decision?
Well, I think the short answer to that is no. The bill and the full text of it was only published 2 weeks or 2 and a bit weeks before MPs were due to vote at second reading, and that's when they vote on the principle of the bill. Now, that's very unusual for a substantive bill. Private members' bills, they don't have to release a text until very shortly before. That's usually because private members' bills are never going to become law, or if they do, it's only on very sort of relatively minor issues on which there's broad agreement, not with this really substantial change to our whole social policy in this country. So, and the bill is very complicated. It suggests involving family courts in the decision, having 2 doctors. There's a very complicated procedure. There's clearly, not sufficient time for MPs to really get to grips with the detail of the bill. So what the proponents of the bill have been saying to MPs is, oh, don't worry about the detail. We know we've got all sorts of issues which you've raised, but if you don't vote in favour at second reading, then you won't have a chance. We won't have full analysis and full debate on this issue. I think that's rather disingenuous myself. I think second reading is a vote on the principle. And this tactic was tried in New Zealand, and it was quite successful in getting their assisted suicide and euthanasia bill passed. What they said the same to MPs, vote at this stage, and then you can sort of have full investigation and analysis of the bill later on. Once you vote at second reading, the bill then creates a certain amount of momentum. MPs have voted in principle. That's what you do at second reading. You're voting on the principle of the bill. So essentially, they will have voted to say, yes, in principle, we think it's okay for doctors to deliberately help their patients to commit suicide. And then it's more just a question of the detail. So I think that's the tactic of the proponents of the bill, to try and create this momentum. Whether MPs will listen to that, I don't know. I've seen a number of MPs who are saying exactly that. They're minded to vote in favour of the bill at second reading, but potentially against at third reading. We'll have to see how that works out. But I think what we do have is enough information on this bill to be clear that there are really significant problems that I think any sort of amendments are unlikely to be able to get round, even if you were to agree with a very sort of narrow principle of assisted suicide.
One of the key topics with this is always this slippery slope, the idea that even if it starts out just being for terminally ill people, later on other groups such as the disabled may become involved. What can we learn from other countries such as Canada and the Netherlands about this?
Yeah, so pretty much every country where they have passed a law like this, there's been some slippage and some move down this slippery slope. So the idea of this slippery slope needs to be clear. It's saying, well, once you've established the principle that it's okay when somebody says they want to die because they're in pain or they're terminally ill, that it's okay to help them rather than to provide care and improve palliative care, then the only question is, well, which groups of people are included in that law? Now, at the moment, this law says your patient will have to have 6 months to live, or a doctor will reasonably assess they have 6 months to live. Now, there's lots of issues there. We know in Canada, for example, that was sort of how their law started off. It then was subject to a legal challenge, and there's serious lawyers in our country who are concerned that, say, for example, a patient who has longer than 6 months to live, or is not even terminally ill, but is in intense pain or feels their life is not worth living, and went to court on human rights grounds to say, well, the law allows a person who's terminally ill, who's actually not in pain at all, to be helped to die, but not me. And legal minds, you never know for sure how judges will rule, but are concerned that a court, so without MPs voting again, may expand the group to non-terminally ill people through the courts. The other thing we've seen in Oregon, so Oregon is often brought up as a sort of example that the proponents of the bill see as a really good model, and they say, well, there's not been, the law's been in place there for well over 20 years and hasn't had significant change. It's not quite true, actually. The Oregon law itself over the past couple of years was initially only for residents and was expanded to allow non-residents, to allow access to assisted suicide. But the other thing that's happened in Oregon and other areas is that although the law says you have to be terminally ill, how is that defined? So we've had examples of patients who are suffering very distressing conditions, for example anorexia, where they're choosing not to eat, and are then refusing treatment. So saying, well, I'm not going to allow myself to be fed and I'm refusing treatment, and then saying, well, because I'm refusing treatment and I'm terminally ill, my life's in danger. And that may be quite right, that without treatment you are indeed terminally ill, and such patients have been then seen as being coming within the auspices of the bill. So even without a court challenge or with MPs on voting on anything different, you may see an expansion to patients who, in the way people would normally understand things, are not terminally ill, but are suffering or feel they're suffering enormously through sometimes psychological conditions, such as anorexia, and are then brought into the remit of the bill. So there's all sorts of ways where the bill will be expanded. Not to say that MPs won't then further pass, once you've established the principle, they won't then change the law as well to vote for different categories of people to come involved. So you can see straight away why disabled groups are so concerned about the bill, and we've had people like Tanny Gray-Thompson in the House of Lords and Baroness Campbell and Lord Chinquin who are disabled people who are really, really concerned on a personal level, but also about the impact and how this will make disabled people who can be very vulnerable and feel that they're a burden, or so they may be treated differently to other people. So it's quite understandable why those concerns are there.
So carrying on with looking at Oregon, if we think about people who are vulnerable and relying on others, and they feel maybe they would take the option of assisted death to stop being such a burden. What did Oregon show us about that?
So there's some interesting cases there. So it's probably worth saying that Kim Ledbetter, who's presenting the bill, claims that within the bill there's safeguards against pressure and coercion, and there's this a new criminal offence will be established of coercing somebody into wanting to access assisted suicide. Now, as people have pointed out to her, it's a very difficult thing to establish when somebody has put pressure on somebody and coerced them, especially after they're dead, to establish how that happened, or to prove that happening is very, very difficult. So I don't think the safeguards in the bill will stop direct coercion. But the more fundamental issue in the bill is this more subtle pressure, where somebody's perhaps elderly towards the end of their life and is worrying about spending resources on a care home and wants to leave money to their family perhaps, and it's just worried about the time their family are taking out of their lives to care for them. And you could have a really loving family who say, mum or dad, please don't worry, we want to do this because we love you. But that doesn't necessarily stop that person still feeling and knowing, and it may be true, it is a burden, even though the family are loving and are happy to take on that burden. The person may still feel that and think, well, actually, it would be better for them if perhaps I die within a few months. So what we know in Oregon, one thing about it does have good data. So when patients die under their assisted suicide law, that patients are asked, well, what are the motivations? What are your end-of-life concerns? Is it about pain? Is it about finance? What are the issues? And one of the things they asked, is, do you feel you're a burden on parents, carers and friends? And roughly just over, between 40 and 50% each year, it varies each year, the last year it was 43%, of patients who die under the Oregon assisted suicide law cite a concern that they are a burden on other people as one of their motivations. So it's a really high proportion of people who come into this category. They're not saying they're coerced, they're saying they feel they're a burden on carers and family. And interestingly, that proportion has increased over time. So one of the things about the assisted suicide in Oregon and in other areas, we've seen after the law is passed, it starts a relatively low number of people are helped to commit suicide, but that rapidly increases over time. We've also seen in Oregon that the proportion of people saying that one of the reasons for assisted suicide is that they're a burden has increased quite dramatically. From the very first year in 1998, it was only 13%, it was a small number of people. Up to the last year, 43%. So this is a real worry. We know from Oregon that it's not a small number of people who are likely to be affected with this more subtle, not coercion, but feeling a burden on other people and thereby feeling they want to take their lives.
There's also some information from Oregon about the end-of-life suffering and the effectiveness of the medications used. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah. So that's the other thing that the Oregon provides some data on. So with these assisted suicide laws, the difference to euthanasia is that with these laws, the patient will be prescribed some medication and then they will take it themselves, usually some drugs, whereas with euthanasia, the doctor will directly administer the drugs, usually with an injection. Now, actually, there's an interesting point on the Kim-Ledbetter law. They say that doctors have to be present when the drug is administered and can assist in its administration. And we're not entirely clear what that means, but that could be, for example, a patient who perhaps can't ingest the medicine themselves, the doctor helping them to do that, lifting a cup to their lips perhaps, or perhaps helping with a syringe with an injection. We don't quite know, but that's a concern. Anyway, sorry, going back to Oregon, they have data on the time it takes from ingesting the drug, taking the drug, to death. And people often have this vision that, you get given a drug and it takes effect immediately and you drift off into sleep and then to death. And, in many cases that may be the case. But we know the controversy with drugs that are given for capital punishment, for the death penalty. We know often there can be side effects. There can be patients they don't work very well on, or they can take a long time to work. Actually, it's the same with assisted suicide drugs. So Oregon will give you the time from the drug to the time of death. In many cases, that is less than an hour. In other cases, it's many more than that. So since they've had their law passed, over 100 patients have taken more than 6 hours to die from when they were given the drug. And in the longest case, it was over 130 hours.
Really?
So
it's more than 5 days.
That's right, about between 5 and 6 days to die. In some cases, a patient is unconscious. In other cases, it takes a while for the patient to become unconscious. And in yet other cases, there have been patients who have regained consciousness. Not very many, but in Oregon, about 9 patients have regained consciousness after taking these drugs. With the Kim-Ledbetter bill, there's no indication of what happens when the drugs don't work. What are the duties of doctors? What happens in that case, or when it's taking a long time for the patient to die. And of course, behind all these statistics, there are real cases. So there's one case in Oregon where a patient took around about 60 hours, had not died, and then woke up. And actually, it was clear the drug hadn't worked. And at that point, this patient decided, well, they didn't want to, no longer wanted to commit suicide, and they died naturally a few weeks later. But in itself, that's a point. You can think, we know that when people commit suicide, there's often reports that they've taken the overdose, what have you. They very often have second thoughts, and there's even stories of people who are jumping off buildings who end up surviving, who realise that halfway through that this was a mistake. They didn't necessarily want to do that. It's very common. What happens with that case when a patient has taken, for example, assisted suicide drug? Maybe takes an hour or two to become unconscious, and in that period tells the doctor they've changed their mind. What are the duties on the doctor? What options are available? These are things which are not mentioned in the Kim-Ledbetter bill, but are really serious concerns.
Kim-Ledbetter said her bill would help reduce the high suicide rate amongst terminally ill people. You've done some published peer-reviewed research around this subject. Could you talk us through it?
Yes, I can. So this has been a long-standing argument of people who promote euthanasia and assisted suicide, that it may reduce other suicides. So the argument goes, well, a patient who is worried about their diagnosis, they've been diagnosed perhaps with an illness that will take a long while, and they may die. And they're worried that at some point if they feel they can't cope, they won't be able to commit suicide. So some patients may commit suicide actually a bit earlier than they would have done otherwise. And some proponents of these laws actually say, well, when it comes to it, many patients they're in this position. They thought they wouldn't be able to cope. As we know, with good palliative care and hospice care, often they feel they can cope. And so they end up not committing suicide. So the argument is, if you can sort of give patients the assurance that if they were desperate, they would be able to have help with suicide later on, you may actually reduce the number of suicides, both totally, but also reduce some unassisted suicides. So, that's an argument. It's not impossible that it may be true in some cases. The other argument, though, is that by legalising assisted suicide, you may sort of reduce the taboos around suicide and make it more sort of acceptable. We know there's so-called suicide contagion. When a young person in an area commits suicide, often there can be a sort of, this contagious effect, and other people try to commit suicide as well. So that's why the World Health Organization has very strict guidelines. News agencies have to be very careful about how they report suicide, so it's not glamorised, because they're aware that when it's in the news a lot, you can create other suicides. So in the end, it becomes an empirical issue. And as an economist, this is one of the things we looked at. What does the data show in states that have legalised assisted suicide in America? And even though I'm opposed to assisted suicide on principle, the data there does provide quite good information for looking at, well, what's the impact on suicides in states that have legalised assisted suicide relative to other states? And you have to be quite careful with this sort of evidence, because you want to say, well, are these otherwise similar states? Would we have seen different trends in suicides had they not legalised the states? And we've got different times, where there's about 10 states have legalised assisted suicide. So that does allow us to control for other factors like, unemployment, different gun laws, drug laws, other factors that might affect suicide rates. And we can then look and say, well, before and after suicide was legalised, over time, what's happened to both total suicide rates, so assisted and other suicides, but also specifically unassisted suicide rates. So that's what we did, myself and Professor Surafel Gurma, who's also at the University of Nottingham, and we published our latest paper in the European Economic Review in 2022. And the data was actually quite clear. When you looked at overall suicides, so including unassisted and assisted suicides, there was a very, very strong effect. So total suicides on average increased in these states by about 18% relative to other states that introduced these laws. And there was a trend to increase over time. So the earlier effect was smaller, but over time we got a bigger and bigger effect. Interestingly, that effect was much bigger amongst women than men. So we know that men are more likely to commit suicide than women. Right. When it comes to assisted suicide, the rates are much, much closer. And our evidence suggested that suicide rates amongst women increased by about 40%. 40%, much more than men. Now that's total suicide. Now the proponents of assisted suicide might say, oh well, okay, that's a good thing, because these are people who would have died in other ways, but are choosing to get help with their deaths towards the end of life. But what happened to unassisted suicides? This is the argument that Kim Ledbetter said, well, this is a real problem of people who are terminally ill committing suicide or are in pain. Did those rates go down? And the answer from our paper was no, they don't. And in fact, there was some evidence that even unassisted suicide rates went up by a smaller amount, around about 6%. And with all statistical data, that was a significant effect, but a little bit more marginal. But for women, again, unassisted suicides went up by much more than for men, and was more strongly significant. So there was reasonably good evidence that unassisted suicides increased significantly, but no evidence at all that non-assisted suicide rates went down. So what seems to be happening, we can't completely rule out that some people sort of transferred, that perhaps would have committed suicide in the absence of an assisted suicide law, then went and committed suicide under the law later on. That there may be some patients like that. We don't look at the individual cases. But if there were, they were outnumbered significantly by other people who were brought in who wouldn't otherwise have committed suicide, and then came in either through the law or committed suicide at their own hand without the assistance of doctors, because of this sort of change to society, that when society is now saying, well, suicide in some cases is an acceptable route to go down, whereas now we say, we have compassion, but it's never okay to assist somebody. But with the law, society is saying, yep, this can be a healthcare solution, and that changes society in itself in quite fundamental ways.
You can see why someone would come to the logical step that if assisted suicide is legalised, there will be less suicides. I think this shows we really need to think about this more and get more evidence on things, because actually your research shows the opposite.
Yeah, that's right. And there's other research. So there's Professor David Jones, who's looked at Europe and a number of different areas that have legalised euthanasia or assisted suicide in different laws. And the evidence, I think, is quite clear. There is no evidence that unassisted suicides decrease when these laws are passed. So we don't necessarily need more evidence now to establish. I think that's a reasonably well established. There's a meta-analysis, which is a sort of a review of reviews of these studies, which comes to the same conclusion, that assisted suicide laws do not reduce other suicides in any statistically significant way, and the evidence is, if anything, they probably increase them. But I mean, it's quite correct to say that you can see why people may think this is the case. This is an example. Whether you think assisted suicide is right or wrong, where we do have good empirical evidence, and I think it's important that MPs and the media as well are informed about that evidence. So for those who are thinking about the practicalities of the bill, are aware of that evidence before they vote on the bill on the 29th of November.
Do you think one of the key problems is this kind of normalising of something that before was quite taboo in society?
Yeah, I mean, it clearly is. So I think we have a law against suicide for a reason, because we're dealing with very, very vulnerable people, and so it's I think it's right that our law now treats those people with compassion and doesn't seek to criminalise the person themselves. But it's a very significant change from saying, well, currently it's never okay to help somebody to die, to move to a situation where we can die. And actually at heart, it's, I think, actually a question of discrimination. So people sometimes talk of human rights and the right to die. Actually, I think there's a human right not to be killed, even when you say you want to. So just to make it very personal, somebody who I knew very well was a lady called Alison Davis, who's now died a few years ago. She was somebody who for many years wanted to commit suicide, and at a point she was actually diagnosed as being terminally ill. She was disabled. She used a wheelchair. She was in very, very severe pain, and the sort of pain that was very hard to control. We have very good palliative care now, but she was a case where it was difficult to control. And she had a settled wish to die. She would have passed every single criteria for assisted death. And she tried to commit suicide as well, and her friends saved her. And she was very angry with her friends for saving her. Really, how dare you do this? Now, as it happened, the doctors were wrong. She lived much longer than the 6 months they thought she had to live, and that's quite not uncommon for doctors to get that wrong. She lived for another 10 years. She changed her mind. So the pain didn't change. The pain didn't go away. In fact, it got worse. As it happened, what was causing her to want to die was something very different. It was something very personal and things going on in her life. But she ended up realising that actually her life was worth living, and her friends loved her and her family loved her. And she no longer wanted to die. Nothing else had changed with her pain, or what have you. And she actually founded a charity. She spoke around the world about the issue of assisted suicide and became a very, very prominent advocate against assisted suicide laws. And she used to say, well, actually, these laws affect vulnerable and disabled people very personally. They target them and they discriminate against them. Because somebody else who says they want to die, who's not terminally ill or not in pain, perhaps at the top of a building about to jump off, we say, oh no, we're not going to help you, we'll look after you, we'll see what we can do. Whereas for somebody like Alison or other vulnerable people, the response is, oh, you want to die? Okay, we'll help you to kill yourselves. So it's discrimination. And she said, well, actually, I want the right as a disabled person or somebody who's in pain to say I want to die without somebody helping to kill me. Because, of course, as we know, people do say all sorts of things when you're vulnerable and in that sort of situation. And sometimes it can be, we know with suicide, it can be a real call and plea for help. And the idea that in the law that, they'll say, oh, it'll have to be a settled wish over a period of time. Well, as Alison says, actually you can be in that situation and express that wish for a long period of time. And we need the right to say, even in that situation, we will say we love you, we will look at how we can help you, but society won't say we will help you to die.
There's obviously an economic side to all of this as well. The president of Belgium's biggest healthcare fund proposed euthanasia as a way of dealing with the costs of an ageing population. And do you think if this bill passed that we would kind of move towards that thinking later on?
I think there's no doubt about that, and it's not later on. We've already had commentators like Matthew Paris a while ago saying exactly that in the Times, saying, well, let's be honest about it, we can't afford to look after an elderly population, and euthanasia is a good response to that. We've seen this in Canada, where we've had veterans who have been told you're really struggling to get care, and even something as simple as a ramp for a wheelchair in, and taking years to get these things done, yet being told, well, we can assist you with assisted suicide. And there's some quite well publicised cases about this. So I think there's no doubt that if the law is passed, there will be pressure on people. We know there is pressure on the health service. Wes Streeting, the health secretary, has verbalised this. He's saying, well, actually, he was somebody who's been ambivalent about assisted suicide in the past, but it says, well, in the current situation where resources are stretched, clearly if you pass a law with assisted suicide, people are going to feel under extra pressure because they may worry that the care isn't there. Now, I think the proponents of assisted suicide don't like this being talked about too much because they know it's not very popular. When people in the public don't like to hear about the idea that we're passing assisted suicide laws to save the state money. So, they try not to sort of talk about this too much publicly, but without doubt it's there, under the surface, and it's a genuine factor, as we know, for people. What Wes Streeting, interestingly, has also talked about the other side, that at the moment, the immediate issue for him will be if this law is passed, there will have to be very significant resources going in to the assisted suicide service, to training up doctors, to looking at the drugs, to looking at both, and also on the legal side with the involvement of the family court. So there's lawyers who are worried that the court system, well, it's already overwhelmed, but simply won't be able to cope because they're expected to deal with every single case here. So actually there's going to be very significant resources dealing, in the short run at least, with the assisted suicide bill if it's passed, and ministers are quite rightly concerned, well, where are we going to get those resources from? Just, for me as an economist, I think we need to be very clear. Economists, we're often accused of, monetising everything and treating only in terms of costs and benefits. And to some extent, that is true. But it's not entirely fair on economists. Economists are good at saying, well, if you do this, this is likely to be the outcome, or these are likely to be the costs and benefits. What we shouldn't, as economists, do is say, well, this is what we ought to do from a right or wrong perspective. And the right thing for MPs and ministers is to get the ethics right. So if we're deciding, well, it's wrong to deliberately kill somebody or help somebody to take their lives, that has to be an absolute. Now, that's very different from an economist, say, taking a policy, say, for example, the speed limit for cars, or whether we should be driving cars at all, and saying, well, you could have a law and it may result in more or fewer deaths, we think, but there may also be costs and benefits in terms of, speed of people getting to work and the economy, which of course can have health issues in themselves. And using that sort of calculation, and as part of that, you might have a sort of economic calculation on the value of a statistical life. Okay, that's not necessarily unreasonable, because we're not saying, we can still say, well, we think somebody has infinite value, as I believe that, but saying, well, statistically, when we're looking at policies that are going to have all sorts of consequences, costs and benefits, how do we take account of the impact on people's health? There's a difference between doing that and deliberately taking the life of somebody. And that's a very different thing. And I think it's perfectly reasonable for everybody to say, well, we will never do that. We will never deliberately take the life of somebody. We will never have the state of an innocent person. We will never have the state saying to a doctor, yes, you can help somebody to take their life, but still think of, in an economic way about general costs and benefits of policies. And I think that's a very important distinction for economists to make when we're looking at policy analysis.
What are the risks of a society where a human life is seen as a kind of cost that can be written off of a balance sheet?
Well, there are all sorts of dangers in that you sort of see people as a sort of means to an end. But as I said, we need to have this distinction right. Costs on a balance sheet, you may have a policy. So let's, for instance, go back to the COVID situation, where you're thinking of the costs of lockdowns and so on. And you may have, well, if we have a lockdown, are we going to save some lives from COVID? Are we going to maybe have other lives caused because of the lockdown and loneliness and people taking their own lives, or longer term deaths from COVID? And what are we going to do about the education of children? And it is reasonable to factor all of these things in, and there's various techniques you can say where you're looking at, say, the value of a statistical life rather than the value of an individual person, and saying, well, we will take into account health impacts in our policy making. I think that's reasonable, but we have to be careful to be sure that you're not treating people as a sort of commodity that you can dispose of. And I think that's where the danger is. Once you see that it's okay to deliberately take a life, you have crossed a Rubicon, if you like, and that becomes a very difficult thing. Then it becomes very difficult to stop this so-called slippery slope and to say, well, if we can do that in principle for one group of people in these circumstances, and perhaps it's the case because they're in pain or they're terminally ill, what about other circumstances? What about a patient who hasn't expressed the will to die because they can't, they're not in a state any longer, but we think they would want to die if they were conscious. Okay? And it's quite hard to argue against that. And then we can say much more broadly, well, what about other groups of people? It becomes a very subjective thing where we're now saying, okay, in some cases it's okay for the state to help somebody to deliberately take their life. So the only issue is now what group of people is that okay to do? And we don't have to go far back in history to find all sorts of cases where people have taken particular groups and said, well, we don't think their life is as valuable as somebody else's life when it comes to deliberately taking their life, so they'll be treated differently. And that's why I think when it comes to taking a life, we need to see people as of infinite value, and that could be from a religious point of view, but it doesn't have to be. It could be you think they're of infinite value because you believe that God loves them and they're of that purpose. But even for non-religious people, it may be because you believe humans have a particular innate, intrinsic value, and therefore to deliberately, take an individual's life is always wrong. Crossing that bridge, that barrier, if you like, opens up society to a very, to anything essentially. It's very hard to then hold back the principle of, not taking somebody's life in particular circumstances.
David Paton, thank you for joining us.
It's been a pleasure, thank you.